Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Today I want to address three particular critical issues. First, is the B.1.617.2 lineage of the Indian mutant becoming a matter of great concern? Secondly, is India experiencing more breakthrough infections than it should? And thirdly, how good is the science behind the decision to extend the gap between two Covishield jabs to 12 and 16 weeks? Those are the three key issues I shall raise today with Professor of Virology at the Christian Medical College in Vellore and a member of the COVID working group, Gagandeep Kang. Professor Kang, let's start with one of the lineages of the Indian mutant B.1.617.2. After cases of this lineage almost tripled last week in Britain, the British advisory group SAGE said to the BBC there is a realistic possibility it could be as much as 50% more transmissible than the UK variant. And given that the UK variant was said to be somewhere between 40 and 70% more transmissible than the original strain, this becomes pretty worrying. But the key question is, how accurate is this assumption? What's your answer to that question? How accurate is this belief that it could be 50% more transmissible than the UK variant?
I think it's a very reasonable assumption, and there are some data that back it up. If we look at what was happening in December, we were trying to figure out whether the variant we now know as B.1.1.7 was more transmissible than the ancestral versions of the virus. And one of the ways that we did that was to look at PCR values. What were the cycle thresholds at which PCRs became positive? That's an indication of how much virus is being shed and acts indirectly as a measure of whether the virus will be more transmissible. At that time, we found that B.1.1.7 was being shed in much greater numbers, and therefore the results showed lower CT values for B.1.1.7 than for the ancestral variants of the virus, D614G, as a comparator. We are now seeing that with B.1.617.2 as well, that there is a lot more virus. People are testing positive at much lower CT values, which means they are shedding more virus and that the virus is more likely to be transmissible. The fact that it is also appearing to outcompete B.1.1.7 lends credence to that assumption as well. We will know more, but in the ways that we investigate which variants are more important, this one does seem to be showing up as being definitely more transmissible than what we've seen in the past.
Let me put another fact to you. The Economic Times reports that according to the Regeneron COVID-19 dashboard, whereas 1% of samples that were sequenced at the end of January turned out to be B.1.617.2, that percentage by the end of April had jumped up to 77%. Does that suggest to you that B.1.617.2 is by far the fastest spreader in India at the moment?
It does appear like that, and that's pretty similar to what we saw first in Maharashtra and then in other parts of the country. If we look back to the early reports that came out from INSACOG, particularly looking at northern India, where B.1.1.7 was the most important variant initially, that has been replaced largely with B.1.617. It does seem to be outcompeting other variants, which means that this is a virus that is more transmissible than others. Will it rise and go away? Will it be outcompeted by yet another variant? That's something that we'll need to wait and see. But this also emphasizes why it's so important to have real-time data on the spread of these variants.
In which case, let me ask you this. Do you believe that B.1.617.2 is the key driver of the surge that we're experiencing at the moment?
I think it's a key component of the surge that we are experiencing at the moment, but it is not necessarily the key driver. We have to remember that all of the variants that we are seeing of SARS-CoV-2 are capable of spreading very easily. This one just spreads more easily than the others. Again, if you look at the sequencing data, it's not like 100% of what we are seeing is B.1.617.2. The others are spreading as well, just at lower rates than what we see with this variant.
So this is a key component because 77% of the samples we see are of B.1.617.2, but it's not the key driver. Is that right?
The drivers include all the things that we discuss every day. What are the behaviors that lead to transmission?
Absolutely. That also includes our failure to follow COVID appropriate behavior. Let me then put a second question of concern regarding B.1.617.2 to you. Is it more likely to lead to serious illness? All the reports that I've seen, both from the United Kingdom and India, suggest that there is no evidence to back up that assumption. Would you agree?
At the moment, we have no data. And I think it is important to emphasize how critical it is to correlate clinical symptoms with sequencing data. And it should work in both directions. We should work backwards from sequence data to look at what the clinical picture was like. But also, we should be looking at selecting strains from a large proportion of people who have a range of clinical symptoms to try and understand which variants are causing those symptoms. Now, for example, we've all heard anecdotally that there are lots of people who have been vaccinated, who have gotten ill, and some who have died, despite having received 1 or 2 doses of vaccine. We are hearing now that we are seeing many more children with much more severe disease. But this is anecdote until you can link clinical information with a denominator and with the sequence data.
So the important point for the audience is that as of today, we do not have any data that suggests that B.1.617.2 is likely to lead to more severe illness, and that will be reassuring. But let me put you a third question concerning B.1.617.2, and in some senses, that's a question that the audience is most concerned to hear the answer to. Is B.1.617.2 more resistant to vaccines? And let me tell you, Professor Anthony Harnden, the Deputy Chairman of Britain's Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunization, says vaccines, and I'm quoting him now, are almost certainly less effective against B.1.617.2. More specifically, the Hindu newspaper on the 15th, referring to reports authored by ICMR scientists, said Covishield and Covaxin are only 50% effective against this strain. So what's your answer to that question? Is B.1.617.2 more resistant to vaccines and antibodies?
First, let's talk about how we respond to vaccines and how vaccines protect us. When we are vaccinated, we make an immune response. Most of the successful vaccines we have so far, the protection is mediated largely by antibodies. In SARS-CoV-2, we definitely think that cellular immunity or T cells play a role, but it's likely that antibodies are the drivers of protection. When you make antibodies in response to a vaccine, the amount of antibodies that you make is as much as possible. So, and vaccines are engineered to make a good immune response. You're not making just enough antibodies to be able to protect you. You make a lot more antibodies than you might necessarily need. So if you were to say that, for polioviruses, for example, when you do neutralizing antibody assays, you want to be sure that a person who has had a polio vaccine has neutralizing antibodies that are above 8. You consider them fully protected if the antibodies measure, neutralizing antibodies are above 1 in 8, right? Usually people will make 1 in 128, 1 in 256, because we test by doubling dilutions. Many will make 1 in 512. Now, if I was to reduce that by half, go from 512 to 256, that person would still be protected. I would need to come down many, many more dilutions for that person to not be protected. So when we make antibodies to SARS-CoV-2 also, there will be a few people who will make just enough antibodies to be protected. But the bulk of individuals who are immunized will make much more antibody than the minimum. So even if you wind up having a 50% reduction, those people who have a reasonable antibody response will be protected even against this variant.
This is
There
a.
may be.
I apologize. I interrupted.
Go
Please
ahead.
finish. Please finish.
So if we think about people who are likely to make just enough antibody to be protected, those are likely to be people who are older, whose immune responses are weaker, who for one reason or the other have not responded as well as the population mean when given these vaccines. But the bulk of the population should expect to have some level of protection. Now, the question is again, protection against severe disease and death is one thing, protection against infection is another. And one of the things that's not clear to us yet, and this is always a problem with mucosal infections, is if you had more antibodies, would you then be protected against severe disease, mild disease, and infection? Or does protection induced by vaccination only extend to protection against disease? We have some data, again from the UK, indicating that if you receive a single dose of the AstraZeneca vaccine, it leads to a reduction in the household of almost half of transmission, which means that the virus is, the vaccines are protecting against people being able to spread disease. Will that hold with the variant? That we need to find out.
This is a particularly important answer, and I want to pluck out from it and put back to you, whether I've understood you correctly, what I think is the most important reassuring message. You said that when we are vaccinated, we make far more antibodies than we actually need. And sometimes it can be a multiple of several hundred more than we need. So even if, because of a particular mutation or lineage of that mutation, Covishield and Covaxin are 50% less protected, it will still leave us with sufficient antibodies to protect us. It's only the elderly or the vulnerable who may end up with just enough to protect them. But as far as the bulk of the population is concerned, even a 50% drop in effectiveness of the vaccine still leaves you with more than enough antibodies to protect you. And that's because initially the vaccine makes more antibodies, many, many more antibodies than you actually need. Have I summed that up accurately, even if my language was technically incorrect?
Your language is entirely appropriate and you've got it right.
Thank you very much indeed. Let me then come to the second big issue I want to raise with you, and that is breakthrough infections. Now, on the 21st of April, Dr. Balram Bhargav, the head of the ICMR, said that depending upon the vaccine you've been given, breakthrough infections range between 0.02% and 0.04. However, anecdotal evidence and I think you spoke about this yourself a moment ago, suggests that breakthrough infections are much, much more. And as a result, Arvinder Singh Soin, the chief surgeon of the Medanta Institute, has told the Economic Times breakthrough infections are higher than we thought. In other words, India's got more breakthrough infections than it ought to have. What's your feeling about that? Are we seeing more breakthrough infections than we should be seeing, or is that purely anecdotal based, not as yet established by data?
When we look for breakthrough infections, we need to decide exactly what we are calling a breakthrough infection. Is an RT-PCR test in the absence of symptoms considered a breakthrough infection? Does it require some level of symptoms or not? What matters for assessing vaccine effectiveness is the presence and the categorization of symptoms. Once again, vaccines are intended to prevent severe disease and mortality. It's a bonus if they protect us against mild disease, and a further bonus if they protect us against infections. So when we define what we call breakthrough infections, we must be very clear about what we are measuring. It's not evident to me that we have that level of information in the remarks that have been made by ICMR. I'm guessing that ICMR is more towards the idea of these were severe cases that happened post-infection. With Dr. Soin's comments, I really don't know exactly what he's referring to, because as far as I'm aware, data on the spectrum does not exist in India. I hope that we will do vaccine effectiveness studies that will provide us with that data.
So are you saying, Dr. Kang, that the number of breakthrough infections are what we should have expected? It's not beyond the ordinary, therefore, it's not a matter of concern.
At the moment, we just don't know. It seems unlikely, given the number of doses of vaccine, that it would be as low as was presented. And it also seems unlikely that without having an understanding of what rates are in other parts of the world, that we would have a handle on what's happening in India with known numbers for similar situations available to us. So, for example, look at the CDC. The CDC said after 75 million doses of vaccine, there were so many deaths, so many hospitalizations, so much severe disease. Do we have that information for India? I don't think we do.
That's a very interesting and also important answer. You're saying, given the number of vaccines we've given, it's very unlikely that breakthrough infections will be as low as what Dr. Bhargav claimed on the 21st of April, i.e., between a range of 0.02% and 0.04%. Given the number of vaccines, it ought to be a bit higher than that. But on the other hand, given that the government doesn't share any data with us, we simply don't know. And that is the position at the moment. We don't know whether the number of breakthrough infections is low, reasonable, or high. Until that data is available, we just don't know.
That's right.
But let me put one more thing to you. There is a paper that was released and made public on Friday, 4 days ago. It's a preprint, I believe. It's been worked upon by scientists from the National Institute of Virology in India, as well as scientists working with Professor Ravindra Gupta and his institute in Cambridge. And this paper studies 33 breakthrough infections at one single hospital in Delhi. The hospital is not named in the paper, but is widely believed to be Gangaram Hospital in Delhi. And the paper concludes, and I'm quoting, the majority of the breakthrough infections were B.1.617.2. Does that underline and emphasize the concerns that we've earlier expressed about B.1.617.2?
So I referred to breakthrough of infection versus breakthrough that is related to symptoms and severe symptoms in particular. I think infection is more likely with a more transmissible strain like B.1.617.2. So I would not find that unusual. The question is, did the vaccines protect particularly against severe disease? And from all that we've heard, the vaccines were protective.
This is another very important distinction. You made it now, and you made it in an earlier answer as well, that we should distinguish between breakthroughs of different types. There's a breakthrough of infection where an RT-PCR test may show you're positive, but you may have no symptoms. And that, you believe, is very different to a breakthrough where you end up with symptoms. And that, in turn, is very different to a breakthrough where you end up with serious disease. And we ought to distinguish between all three types of breakthroughs, not club them together.
In all vaccine effectiveness studies, that's what is done. In this case, it's a report from a single hospital. But these are the kinds of studies that we should be doing nationwide in situations where there are different levels of transmission of the virus.
Okay, one last question about this study focusing on Gangaram Hospital. And I ask it simply to be thorough. The vaccine that was given at Gangaram, I believe, is Covishield. Does the fact that there were 33 breakthroughs in one hospital raise questions about the efficacy of Covishield, or is that an unwarranted inference?
Going back again to what I said, was this infection? Was this severe disease? Covishield, Covaxin, both are expected to perform well against severe disease. At the moment, we are in a situation where the country has used 90% Covishield and 10% Covaxin. So if there are going to be reports like this, there should be 9 reports of Covishield compared to 1 report of Covaxin. This is still our first report.
Quite right. And so once again, we can't come to conclusions. Let me then come to the last issue I want to raise with you. The question, is there good science behind the decision to extend the gap between 2 jabs of Covishield to 12-16 weeks? Now, I'm going to quote to you the official press release issued by the Health Ministry, and its contents were repeatedly echoed by Dr. Paul in his press conferences. This is the justification the Ministry of Health's press release offers, and I'm quoting, based on the available real-life evidences, particularly from UK, the COVID-19 working group agreed for increasing the dosing interval to 12-16 weeks between 2 doses of Covishield vaccine. Now, the truth is, until the UK reversed its position, the UK policy was to extend the gap up to 12 weeks, not 12-16. So my first question is, where does 12-16 come from?
I think it comes from the fact that a lot of the UK dosing in the trials was beyond 12 weeks. So if we go back to the issues with the dosing interval in the phase 3 trials, there was a distinction between what was given at less than 6 weeks, 6 to 12 weeks, and then beyond 12 weeks. And there were data at that time to indicate that your best efficacy results were actually beyond a period of 12 weeks. The JCVI, which decides on immunizations in the UK, made a decision to extend both Pfizer, for which there was no evidence, and the AstraZeneca vaccine, for which there was the phase 3 trial evidence, to a 12-week gap. They did this starting in December, and from December onwards, authorities in the UK and in Scotland have been gathering data on the performance of these vaccines. The early signals that the 12-week gap was protective started to come out very shortly after they started their vaccination programs.
So can I ask you this? because it intrigues me and it will intrigue the audience. The official policy of the UK government was to extend the gap up to 12 weeks, not beyond. But are you saying that in actual practice, the UK actually extended the gap beyond 12 weeks, and therefore we have data from the UK about the improvement in efficacy as the gap goes beyond 12 weeks towards 16? Is that what you're saying?
No, what I said was in the phase 3 efficacy trial, there was data beyond 12 weeks. Once the program started, yes, once the program started, the program had a 12-week gap between the AstraZeneca and the Pfizer vaccine. So the real world evidence that has been gathered has been largely around protection from the first dose in the 12 weeks between the first and second doses.
You said something very important. The real world data that we've got from the UK is about efficacy of the first dose up to 12 weeks. The belief that there is efficacy even beyond 12 weeks, all the way up to 16 weeks, doesn't come from real world data in the UK. It comes from some of the phase 3 trials of AstraZeneca itself. That, however, was not mentioned by Dr. Paul. He didn't say that the real world data that I'm relying on to go beyond the UK policy of 12 weeks all the way to 16 weeks is not from UK, it's from phase 3 trials of AstraZeneca. That's an interesting distinction. I'm not saying that the data doesn't hold up, but let me ask you this. How good is that phase 3 trial data from AstraZeneca to extend the gap from 12 to 16? Because clearly UK doesn't give you data to do that. So how good is the trial data from AstraZeneca for that purpose?
Well, one thing that's really important to remember is that when you induce protection by a single dose of vaccine, it does not switch off at a magical number. So whether that is 10 weeks or 12 weeks or 14 weeks or 16 weeks, it doesn't mean that you have protection until then and then you have no protection. So there have been modeling studies that have been done that seem to indicate that actually you can get protection from a single dose as you can from infection that lasts up to 6 months. So these are...
That I understand, but isn't there a danger as you extend the gap over 12 weeks that the protection will start tapering off? It won't crash downwards as if it's fallen off a cliff, but will start tapering off. And therefore, you might have maximum protection up to 12 weeks, which is what the UK believes. But if you extend it beyond that, not on the basis of UK data, but on the basis of efficacy data got from AstraZeneca's trials. And by the way, I should add that those were serendipitous accidents on the part of AstraZeneca, but let's leave that aside. Then as you extend beyond 12 towards 16 weeks, it could start tapering off the efficacy. So people may not be as well protected in the 13th, 14th, 15th week as they would have been in the 11th and 12th.
I would take us back to our thinking around adenovirus vector vaccines. So remember that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is an adenovirus vector vaccine that is a single dose. So we believe that that is going to give us protection until we understand when and if a booster is going to be required.
Johnson & Johnson was designed as a single-dose vaccine. AstraZeneca was not. AstraZeneca requires the booster after the primer. Johnson & Johnson doesn't. But let me put this to you.
No, that is not the case. So in fact, the AstraZeneca vaccine, when the University of Oxford set out to make it, they were intending it as a single-dose vaccine.
But they didn't end up as one. When they came to the market, it came as a double dose.
It came as a double dose. The only reason was for insurance, because what they did was they did an immunogenicity study in the early days of the vaccine.
But now, Professor Kang, you're close to suggesting that the booster may not be necessary at all.
So this is something that we are thinking about.
Okay, let me put this to you. There are 2 countries, I believe, that have recommended the gap should be beyond 12 weeks
16
all the
weeks.
way to 16. Those are Spain and Canada. But interestingly, neither the press release from the Ministry of Health nor any of the comments made by Dr. Paul in his press conferences refer to Spain and Canada at all. Is that because we don't have real world data from Spain and Canada that justifies us emulating their practice?
At the moment, there have been few doses given in Canada for us to be able to have that estimate. And again, Spain has been using this in their program, but I haven't yet seen data from there. I think one of the things that's really important to understand is that when advisory committees make recommendations, the recommendations are not necessarily based only on the information that is provided by the manufacturers. That's what JCVI did. And that's what the National Advisory Committee on Immunizations in Canada has done.
Absolutely, and I'm not disputing that. I'm simply saying that the real world data that was available to your committee and thereafter to the government, on the basis of which you agreed to extend the gap up to 12, 16 weeks, is not real world data from the UK, even though the government keeps referring to the UK repeatedly, but that real world data is not from the UK. It comes, as you said, from the efficacy trials of AstraZeneca itself. And as I said, those were serendipitous accidents. There is going to be, in due course, real world data from Spain and Canada that might support extending up to 16 weeks. But again, as you said, at the moment, we don't have real world data from those two countries. We'll get it in due course. So that
we have,
but not
yeah,
sufficient.
sorry.
Not sufficient.
We have really strong real world data from the UK up to 12 weeks.
That's right, but not beyond.
We have modeling beyond 12 weeks indicating that those effects will persist. I think it is a reasonable assumption to say that they will persist well beyond actually 16 weeks.
I don't want to quarrel with you. I don't want to quarrel with you. I'm only referring to the press release put out by the Health Ministry, which said, based on the available real life evidences. Real life evidences, I assume, is the same as real world data. And it added, particularly from the UK, but we don't have real life evidence from the UK beyond 12 weeks. We have modeling beyond 12 weeks, not real life evidence. Real life evidence stops at 12. And as yet, we still await good real life evidence from Spain and Canada, but it hasn't come. So the science is essentially based upon the AstraZeneca efficacy trials, where some doses were separated by more than 12 weeks. But as I said, those were serendipitous accidents. I won't comment on whether this therefore adds up to good science to back up the decision to delay the gap to 12-16, or bad science or questionable science. Let the audience decide for themselves. We've aired the subject. Every individual should decide for themselves and not have me comment on it and prejudice them.
I don't think that that's correct. I think the evidence needs to be informed. You know, modeling is a science. So I accept that when you talk about real world evidence that goes up to 16 weeks, yes, we don't have effectiveness data up to 16 weeks. But do we have sufficient data up to 12 weeks and an understanding of what is likely in the future to be able to make a recommendation to 12 to 16 weeks? That, yes, undoubtedly we do.
Okay, I think you've given me a very clear answer. We don't have real world data of effectiveness up to 16 weeks, but we do have modeling that suggests that effectiveness will continue beyond 12 weeks. And that's the basis on which your committee made the recommendation and the basis on which the government accepted it. Unfortunately, the government in its press release only talked about real life evidence, particularly from the UK. It didn't talk about either modeling, nor did it talk about the AstraZeneca efficacy trials. But that's the government's prerogative. My last question. Now, as the Health Ministry press release repeatedly says, our decision is particularly guided by the UK. The paradox is that 36 hours after we announced our decision to extend the gap all the way to 16 weeks, the UK went in the other direction and reduced the gap to 8 weeks for people over 50 and people who are considered vulnerable. And it did this specifically and publicly because they were apprehensive of the potential impact of B.1.617.2. Now, that's a variant that is rampant in India. As you said, it's a key component of the surge in India. 77% of the samples that have been sequenced turn out to be this particular strain. In that case, shouldn't we have followed the UK's example?
The UK has made a decision at a time when they have this particular variant being a variant that is spreading much more rapidly than anything else. They have no data to say that being able to immunize faster over 50s will reduce breakthrough infections and breakthrough disease or slow down transmission. So let's be very clear that this is also not a decision that is driven by incidence of disease in the over 50s or any understanding of what will happen to the immune response, particularly in terms of being able to neutralize this particular virus in the over 50s as compared to a younger population.
In other words,
the UK has,
it's a presumptive measure taken by the UK rather than a data-driven measure.
Absolutely.
And therefore, there's no need for us to follow suit, at least now.
I don't think we should be following suit at this time. I will speak to what I've been talking about for a while now, is the importance of doing vaccine effectiveness studies so that we understand the impact of 1 or 2 doses of both the vaccines that we are using. We understand that in India, when you have an immunization program, you don't always get your doses exactly on time. So therefore, understanding how much protection you get from each dose is really important. And if I had one message for policymakers, it would be to urgently put in place vaccine effectiveness studies across the length and breadth of India using all the possible study designs that they can find.
So we urgently need vaccine effectiveness studies, but as of today, we don't need to follow the UK, who've taken a presumptive decision rather than a database decision. We could happily continue with our policy of expanding the gap to 16 weeks. Data, if it comes later on, might require a change, but that is not the situation today. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Professor Kang, I thank you for this interview. In particular, I thank you for indulging me when I seemed to quarrel with you over the science behind the gap. I'm in no position to quarrel. You are an expert and authority on the subject. I'm just a journalist asking pesky questions. But it occurred to me from the answers you gave, which were very honest, that in fact, what is clear is that the government claims the decision is based on UK real-life evidence, but in fact, UK real-life evidence stops at 12 weeks. It doesn't extend up to 16. AstraZeneca efficacy trials provide evidence of that, as does modeling. I thank you for making that clear. I hope my questioning does not mislead the audience. My intention was for them to have all the information available so they can decide for themselves. A million thanks. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you.